Hi everybody, welcome back to Visual Narratives. This is our penultimate class, so next to last class for spring 2020. It's weird to have gotten here already in this form. This is not obviously what I was expecting nor what you were expecting, but here we are. And I don't want to talk too much about the semester as it's turned out just yet. I'll save that for my last lecture, which will come next week. Today, however, kind of like everything else, I've mixed up or changed radically the syllabus just because it's just been necessary to do so because of this new format that we find ourselves in. So just to let you know what we were going to do, and just so you know what was on the syllabus and what I've changed it to. So today was supposed to be about narrative and gaming, you know, how it relates technologically to the story and through line, which I'm kind of glad we did the Pixar shorts study, because I think that even though those aren't games, obviously, or you could probably make digital games out of them if you tried. We did talk about the relationship of the tech to the story, and I'm going to do I was going to do a brief history of gaming and narrative, from like simple side-scrolling games to full-blown immersive games, and the art that's required for both. And then, well, no, we're not doing readings anymore. I really had some rather heavy-handed academic readings that I thought were particularly interesting, but more on the idea of academic readings about these things next week. I've made a couple of revelations, had some epiphanies about this class and just these types of classes in an art school in general. And yeah, I'll tell you about that next week. I hope I can remember, because epiphanies come and go. Now I'll be able to remember. But so I wanted to briefly discuss the responses, the discussion points that you submitted to the forum, and I appreciate your participation, although it was a little shorter in terms of numbers than what has happened in the past couple weeks, which I suppose is to be expected, but it was a vast majority of people, so that's not a huge deal. And I know that I've been reading excerpts from people's work from the forums too, as a form of sort of live discussion that I'm doing here, as opposed to a live lecture where I'd be able to ask you questions and really go back and forth. So I thought that was fun to do, and I'm sure it was fun for you to hear your own words read back to you, or hear the opinions of other students. But today I'm going to kind of forego that, because I wanted to talk about the overall premise that I had set for the discussion points that you made for the Pixar shorts, and the prompts that I had in that regard. I have to confess that I set it up last week in a way, during the lecture, in a way that sort of made it seem like I may have been privileging the better technology over the older technology, in saying that storytelling can only be told at a particular level because, or if better technology is available, whether it's CGI or filmmaking in general or whatever. And I don't. That was kind of a falsehood. I was messing with you. It was a little deceptive. It was a bit of reverse psychology. I wanted to kind of have that floating around in your head, like, is he really saying that? I'm not sure. And then, being precocious college students, sort of bump up against that and maybe argue that point after having watched some of the older and some of the newer Pixar shorts, and grouping them together and seeing if that held any water or not. And the majority of you felt that it kind of didn't, that the films that were made, the short films that were made, the CGI that was used at that time was compatible with the storytelling in its time, because they didn't necessarily write beyond the capability of the technology that was available. Purposefully done, purposely so. The better the technology got, the more complex the stories became, but only because the technology became commensurate with the ability to tell a story. So when you only have simple tools to tell the story, but you want to use them because you're trying to develop the technology, then you write a story commensurate with the tools. So a lot of you did come to the conclusion that it was really more based on storytelling and the quality of storytelling than it was necessarily the quality of the technology and the ability of CGI or any kind of animation to deliver the story. So, I think Kitbull was actually maybe one of the better examples that a lot of people chose, not because it was the newest one necessarily, although it is kind of an interesting coincidence that it is one of the newest ones on the list, because it doesn't rely on that fully blown, fully rendered, plasticized CGI that a lot of the other ones do. It has a more traditional 2D kind of look to it, because it was doing that in an homage to that old 2D style of cell animation and painted backgrounds. This is not to say that it wasn't done completely digitally, because I believe that it was. It wasn't old cell animation and Mylar pages that were flipped back and forth like an old Flintstones cartoon, but it did sort of pay homage to that period of time where that was the process. So it had a lot of that look to it, and yet it was able to tell a very endearing and somewhat complex story, because it was a wordless narrative with the animals not being anthropomorphized. So the message of that really, really got through. So there you go. It's really about storytelling and really about narrative, and you can make the visual commensurate with the narrative if you have the ability to do so. And if you don't, then you write it differently, or you present it differently according to the materials that you have available. And I think being students, most of you being students in an art program where you don't necessarily have all the fancy tools available to be able to show all of your ideas in the ultimate manner possible that you would envision. If you had all the tech and all the money at your disposal to be able to throw your work out into the world, you would use it, and your ideas might change as a result of it. But you don't necessarily have that, so you sort of write to what you have, which makes complete sense. I mean, you push against the boundaries of what you have available, and you try and make it as interesting as possible, but that's through just good storytelling, good editing, good idea generation, the ability to thumbnail things out, like in a way that it makes sense at the most simple 2D level, so that whatever you translate it to, it's still going to translate just fine. So I appreciate all the responses. I thought were great. I loved the kind of emotive responses that a lot of people had to these things. A lot of people were very moved by some of the stories that they had not seen before. In some cases, very awed by the level of visuals that you had maybe not seen before, like something like Piper, for instance, which is a high degree of realistic effects, realistic camera effects, all done digitally. Or the heartstring pulling of something like Bow or Kitbull, where you just can't help but shed a couple of tears, because it really gets you right in the place that they're trying to get you. So good storytelling right there, meshed with good visuals. So just to move on kind of quickly from there, I want to talk about our final assignment. So, I won't have to call it up. You can check it yourself. The last day of classes, which would have been the last class on the 28th, would have featured a screening of the Animatrix, which is the kind of bridge film between The Matrix and Matrix Reloaded. But the Animatrix is a series of 9 different animations that, yeah, they're extant. We're not well. They're based on the extant stories of the Matrix, like the trilogy part. But they're a lot of them are side stories, and a lot of them are direct bridges. So it's a wonderful experiment. So just to so since I can't show you that and talk about it with you in class, then you're going to have to kind of see for yourself, because I did want feedback on this, because I feel like the Matrix franchise, and not necessarily the latter 2 movies. I mean, these movies, as they progress from 1 to 3, sort of like diminish in their returns, as far as I believe, my opinion. But there is sort of larger opinion about them, that they don't quite deliver as well in each subsequent movie. The third one being not all that satisfying at all, because it doesn't really put things together in the way that I think everybody was expecting or looking for, or something that actually made sense. But whatever. It's not about a critique of these per se. The Matrix as a construct, and I use that word in sort of a dual meaning. The Matrix itself in the film is a construct, but the Matrix stories are a construct that houses a philosophical idea that was put forward back in the 60s by Jean Baudrillard in a treatise of his called Simulacra and Simulation. So the idea of a virtual world was floated philosophically way before virtual worlds were even anything, were a glimmer in some code writer's eye. That philosophy was already sort of taking this on. And yeah, so the existence of a world that was predicated only on our own ability to think about it, something that was in our minds, and it's not something that we were experiencing in reality. But reality is a thing that you put in quotes in that case, because if you are in that matrix, so, to use the word again, with a lowercase m, if you're in that matrix, your perception of reality is that. You don't have a clear discernment over, like, what is your reality except the thing that you are experiencing. And of course, Baudrillard goes on to sort of talk about virtual experiences, and how we will lament real experiences, and the lamentation of the real experience becomes more of a real experience than the experience itself. Okay, I know, it's complicated. It's very complicated. I'm not asking you to go read French philosophy in order to understand any of this stuff. You don't have to. The Wachowskis already kind of broke it down into a really cool dystopian action film, so you get the idea. But just to know that it stemmed from something that was very, very heady and complicated, and still is to a great extent, because if you think long and hard enough about it, you can tend to question what is reality. I think maybe that question has come up more often these days than it has in the past, considering everything. So anyway, if you have not seen the Matrix trilogy in its entirety, that's okay. Even if you have not seen the Matrix first film itself, I guess that's okay too. Although getting a general understanding of, like, what the Matrix is, and I did sort of show you that early on in the semester when I talked about exposition and setup, and we had that great setup that's Lawrence Fishburne's character of Morpheus sets up for Keanu Reeves' character Neo, when they talk about red pill, blue pill, and what is the Matrix and all that stuff. Great piece of exposition, but it also tells you exactly what the Matrix is, even though Neo doesn't quite understand it until he experiences it for himself. So what I was going to show you, and what I do want to talk about a little bit and set it up, is the Animatrix. And I should have put in the poster for that. I did not. Well, anyway, the Animatrix is... oh, sorry. I should mention the dates on these. So, 1999, early 2003, late 2003. These were kind of written and shot almost together after the incredible success of the first film. So also in 2003, however, came the Animatrix film, which, as I said, is a series of 9 animated pieces with a lot of different animators, some the same, some different, in almost, well, 8 different styles. Although, like I said, there are a couple of the same animators on some of the projects, because there's one sequence that's a part 1 and part 2. So it's really 8 animators and 9 installments of animations that kind of bridge the gap in some ways between the first and second film, and some exist as sort of side stories that kind of give you a kind of more widespread idea of how the Matrix affects the realities of others that are not actually involved directly in the story. So the first one is Flight of the Osiris, which is actually one of the ones that's directly connected to the bridging of the Matrix and Matrix Revolutions. So it was a Wachowski story that was adapted and directed by Andy Jones, and it was a Square Pictures animation in 2003. Now, I think the humanoid animation in this for 2003 is quite excellent. It was, I think Square Pictures was also responsible for the Final Fantasy films, and depending on how you feel about those things, I think, you know, in their early production we were dealing with some uncanny valley stuff with regard to CGI rendered humans. They look kind of good, and then there were some parts of them where you're like, yikes. So that's that yikes is the uncanny valley. I think this one sort of transcends that. It gets really close in a very early stage, 2003, of doing some really good rendering of people and skin and action to a degree. But again, it's the storytelling here that's important, and that's what I want you to look at. I want you to look, again, kind of like the Pixar breakdown, the storytelling and the visuals and how it's conveyed, and whether it's got clarity for you and whether it has resonance for you within the construct of the idea of the Matrix. So Final Flight of the Osiris, oh, this is kind of small. I really like the visuals of this particular one. This represents the second Renaissance, and this is the one that's split into 2 parts. So there's a part 1, there's a part 2. It's basically the whole idea is that you're a person accessing the archives of the Matrix, and you kind of see the histories of humankind and how machine kind kind of came to take over. So this was from actually some journals of the Wachowskis it's actually called Bits and Pieces, adapted by Mahiro Maeda and directed by him, and then Studio 4 Degrees Celsius, which is a pretty famous Japanese studio out of Tokyo that handles quite a few of the films, a few of the animated pieces here, and they have a huge laundry list of excellent animated film. A couple of notes about this particular piece. It is kind of acting as an historical document, so there's a lot of things that look like news footage and things like that. And in terms of its presentation, the styles, even within this one piece, even though it's one studio that's handling it, jump around quite a bit. Some of the things are homages to visuals that you may have seen before. And like I said, like some look like news footage and old war footage that you may have seen before that's adapted into the story. And then the other thing I want to mention is, especially part 2, some of it's pretty horrifying, because, you know, the history of war in real time in this country is horrifying, and so it's using some of those horrifying images to sort of flesh this story out in a similar way. So kind of trigger warning on that. There's some body horror things and wartime horror things that happen certainly in part 2. But if you can sit through that, I think it gives you a really good picture of the history of humankind versus machine kind, and kind of puts you on a little bit of a different level of understanding of what it is to be a human and what it is to be a machine inside this particular story, inside the Matrix stories themselves. Okay, after those come Kid's story, and it's not a kid's story like a story for kids. There's a character named the Kid. I don't know what his actual name is. That is appears in Matrix Revolutions and Matrix Reloaded, and so this is one of those things that sort of bridges a gap for a particular character that's very kind of minor, but this experience in this particular story, again, is one of those things that sort of fleshes out the idea of the Matrix and sort of like the different levels of reality that people are living and people are experiencing when bumped up against the construct of the Matrix. And this is Shinichiro Watanabe, who's actually got a huge list of films, directed animated films that he's directed, and again, this is Studio 4 Degrees Celsius from Tokyo. Now, this one, I kind of have a real soft spot for a program because it's animated by Madhouse, which brought to you so many different things that you probably... They did Cardcaptor Sakura, actually, but one of my favorites out of the 80s was some or early 90s, I want to say, maybe, was Ninja Scroll. And so really this is done in the style of Ninja Scroll, the really hard, contrasty, almost like, you know, an inked manga page with like the dark blacks for all the shadow. And it's also an homage to Ninja Scroll itself, and the fact that this is like samurai based action going on in this particular one. This one sort of exists sort of in and of itself, but again, it gives you another level of understanding of the concept and construct that goes on within the Matrix story and the Matrix world itself. So this one, nice visual treat, at least for me. So here's another Madhouse piece, and you can kind of see like right away, even though maybe the anatomical design and the not so traditional anime look is there in insofar as like the figuration is concerned, but as far as the coloration is concerned, it still looks like a Madhouse animated feature. So this is called World Record. It's Takeshi Koike. And yeah, it's about a runner. It's like a sprinter, and that's kind of like the whole story. And if you like bullet pointed like what this is about, you'd just be like, how can you make a whole piece out of this? But they do a phenomenal job. So it's almost about the physicality of like what it is to bump up against the Matrix when the physical body is pushed to certain levels of extremity, and I won't give you too much information from there, but it's a good one, and visually it's super interesting, stylistically. This one, let's turn this off here, it's called Beyond, Koji Morimoto, and again, Studio 4 Degrees Celsius. Different style though, and almost like a different atmosphere altogether to this particular one. This, I would say, is definitely one of those side stories that doesn't really have an impact on the trilogy stories themselves, but it's a beautifully done piece. So much atmosphere, and it really gives you a vision into a side of the Matrix and its effects on individuals' quote-unquote reality that you don't get at all from the films. So a very, very pretty and atmospheric piece. Very enjoyable. It's actually a nice pause in the midst of all the action. Yeah, it visually very striking piece. You'll enjoy that one. Oh, so we had that whole discussion about noir films and everything, and so yeah, one of the Animatrix pieces is a noir piece itself called A Detective Story. So again, Shinichiro Watanabe, doing the direction here, and animated by Kazuto Nakazawa, in this, high contrast, dark and light noir tale, and it's also narrated and acted by the animated characters as very much as if it were a noir detective story, except the bleeding through of the Matrix tropes are right there in the film. So, yeah, it's a really cool sort of like period piece without necessarily being a period piece. It's a period piece in visuals only, but a great just direction to sort of take a Matrix story into. And I think lastly, this is my personal favorite out of all of them, and it happens to be the last one. It's a piece called Matriculated by Peter Chung, and DNA Productions handled most of the animation, although Peter Chung did the majority of the designing of the characters. And if you've heard his name before or haven't heard his name before, he was most associated with the animated short episodic cartoon called Eon Flux, which appeared on MTV a long time ago, eons ago, when they were first running liquid television. I remember seeing that come on in the late 90s, early 2000s, and just, actually, just, it was just like late 90s, yeah, because I was in my like mid-20s, I think. And just saying, well, what is this? It's so different the way he renders figures. Definitely a big fan of Egon Schiele, the great Austrian figurative artist. And up until that point, I had never seen anyone design their characters based on that guy's work before. But sure enough, Peter Chung took that ball and really ran with it. This is a pretty advanced piece of animation for him because it has a fascinating combination of traditional animation and CGI. The CGI really starts stepping in, not just with the robot characters, the machine characters, but also when it goes into this sort of like deconstruction of a robot or machine's mind or program, as it were. It gets really super trippy. So there's a lot of very cool CGI effects, but the story in this one maybe is the most oblique in terms of its linearity. You have to derive quite a bit from what you're being shown, because what you're being shown is so visually striking and strange that you're going to ask yourself what's happening, and then it ends in a particular way where it leaves you in a space where you kind of have to put it all together. So that's one of the reasons why I really enjoyed this one, because it's a lot headier, and a lot of Peter Chung's stuff is like that. He wrote Eon Flux in the same way. So I'm looking forward to responses to this one as well. So let me get out of here. Jump back on screen myself. So yeah, so I'm assigning the Animatrix to you with the intent of you sort of doing a similar kind of breakdown to what you did with the Pixar films. So when you were looking at those, you were kind of looking at the quality of the animation versus story and how those two things mesh together. This I'm not going to ask too much about quality per se. It's more about style and more about delivery and how that affects story. And depending on your knowledge of the Matrix as a whole, umbrella franchise itself, will help you a little more with your insights as to how these things deliver that narrative to you. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it. I'm sure a lot of you are probably familiar with the Animatrix too, but now you have a chance to watch it again, or pieces of it again, and really look at it a lot more critically because of what I'm asking you to do. So I'll of course put all these things in the announcements for you to follow, but um, you don't have to watch all of them. You can watch, you can pick some based on the presentation that I did here, and pick one that looks most, or two that look most interesting to you, because I want you to do at least two. You can talk about as many as you want, or the whole thing as a whole, and then kind of break down each individual one and talk a little bit about each and how that delivers it for you. Again, I want you to come at it from a personal place too. I want you to sort of insert your own personal opinion in there, but just kind of back it up with, a critical level of language and engagement. Everything that you've been doing so far. I think everyone's on board with how to talk about these things, but I just don't want you to forget that, because some of them are so complicated, I suppose, philosophically, that you could kind of go down that rabbit hole, but I'm not requiring that, and I'd rather hear how this affects sort of your perception of what the Matrix is, what that particular story does inside all the stories, and what it does for your understanding of it, and how the medium, in this case, the stylistic medium, not just animation, but the style, that particular style of animation, how in how that's presented, how that drives the narrative, how it helps the narrative to read, how it gives it atmosphere, how it gives it impact, all those things. So of course I will bullet point all that stuff so that you can remember and do it. As far as access to the Animatrix is concerned, there's kind of a lot of access. As the film as a whole, I mean, it's eminently rentable on any platform. I think the cheapest I've seen it is like $1.99 on like YouTube or Vimeo or something like that. But if you, and I will list all of the shorts individually with their dates. If you plug that into YouTube or something like that, if they're cut up, you can actually watch them on an individual level and probably not have to pay a dime towards it. So the access is really good. I don't think you'll have a problem accessing any of these or all of them at once. So that should be fairly easy to do. Now, this will be the last assignment. This will be the last time I ask you to like watch something or read something or respond to something that's been given to you. But I am gonna ask you to do one more piece in the discussion forum next week too. So I don't want you to think it's like, oh, it's the last assignment, I don't have to listen to this guide and carry on anymore. I mean, I could carry on even more, but I'm not going to. But I will deliver you one last lecture next week to kind of sum up not just the class itself, but my experience with the class, which is kind of what I'm going to ask you to do, is talk about your experience with the class and your experience in this sort of new format or unexpected format. But I'll talk about that more next week. In the meantime, enjoy the Animatrix, enjoy these pieces, and I hope you have a great week, and I will talk to you very soon. Stay safe and stay well, and get outside and get some sun, and I'll talk to you real soon. Thanks. Bye.